I grew up in a household dominated by my parents' extreme favoritism toward my older sister, Christina. My entire childhood, I felt like I was nothing but a prop to make her look better. She was given better clothes, was sent to fancy camps, and got all kinds of praise for the smallest achievements. Meanwhile, I had to figure things out on my own. Mom and Dad always told me it was because Christina was special and needed extra attention. But in reality, I suspect she reminded them of the perfect child they'd always dreamed of, while I reminded them of how tough parenting really is. Still, I always tried to keep the peace, even when it meant stuffing down my frustration. I was the classic good kid who never wanted to make waves. It's no wonder that despite everything, I actually believed they would celebrate my 18th birthday properly. I'm turning 18 soon, and I guess I was naive to think it might be my chance to shine for once. I'd heard rumors they were planning a small party. I didn't have many close friends because I rarely got permission to hang out after school, but I still felt grateful they were planning something at all. I kept telling myself, maybe this time they'd finally treat me like an equal. That's why, when the day came closer, I was more excited than I'd ever been. It felt like a second chance, a fresh start into adulthood. I was about to learn exactly how much my parents valued me and how deep their betrayal could run. My parents initially hinted they'd rent a small space and invite a few family friends, plus any of my classmates I wanted to bring. That was all I knew. Christina acted suspiciously uninterested, which was weird because she usually tried to upstage me at every opportunity. She was the type who would show off her new dress if it even tangentially competed with something I had going on. This time, though, she seemed almost bored. I should have noticed the red flags, but I chalked it up to her usual mood swings. The day before my birthday, I asked Mom what time the party would start. She said, "Oh, about 7, but remember, don't get your hopes up, okay? It's just a small gathering." I shrugged it off. Even if it was small, I still thought it was better than nothing. Little did I know, there would be no party at all. On the morning of my birthday, I woke up giddy. I got dressed in my nicest outfit and tried to help out around the house, hoping to show my parents I was grateful. But something felt off. There were no decorations, no food preparations, and zero mention of anything special. I asked Dad if we should pick up a birthday cake. He gave me a blank look, like he had no idea what I was talking about. Then he muttered something about me needing to watch my attitude. Confused, I tried to clarify. "Mom said there would be a small party tonight, right?" He waved me off, saying, "You must have misunderstood. There's no party. We canceled it days ago." I remember standing there, heart pounding, feeling like my entire life was one big punchline. They hadn't bothered to tell me they'd pulled the plug on my own 18th birthday. I felt a burning sensation in my eyes, but I refused to cry. I asked Dad why they canceled. He just shook his head, telling me it was none of my business. That was the moment Christina swooped in with her signature smirk. "They had to cancel because I'm having a big night with my friends, and it clashed with your thing," she said, rolling her eyes as though my birthday was an inconvenience. I turned to Mom for clarification. She shrugged, adding that they couldn't manage 2 events at once, and Christina's was more important since it involved her private dance team from college. "You'll have plenty of birthdays in the future," Mom said, dismissing me entirely. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why not just do it another day? Why not let me in on the decision? The sense of betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. I tried to process it rationally, telling myself that maybe finances were tight or there was a scheduling conflict. But every time I tried to reason it out loud, they shut me down with snide comments. Dad accused me of being selfish for wanting to celebrate while the family had bigger concerns. When I pressed further, Christina started whining about how I was ruining her vibe. They ridiculed me for being dramatic and told me if I didn't like their decisions, I could leave. I should have realized that was more than an empty threat. It turned out they had another plan brewing. Meanwhile, I locked myself in my room, stared at the blank walls, and wondered if it was worth confronting them or if I should just run away. I felt like I'd never win. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, I'd be told I was ungrateful. Afternoon rolled around, and I was starving. No one had even bothered to ask if I'd eaten. The house was eerily quiet, aside from Christina blasting her music in the living room, presumably warming up for her friends. I tiptoed into the kitchen to make a sandwich, and there were dirty dishes piled up in the sink from the night before. My parents had never been consistent about chores unless they were using them as a weapon against me. Christina rarely washed a dish, and they never got on her case for it. But I always ended up with an ultimatum. My plan was to quickly rinse the dishes, make my sandwich, and go back to my room. But as soon as Mom spotted me, she exploded, claiming I'd let the dishes sit there all morning. She screeched that I was lazy and irresponsible. I tried to defend myself, but my voice got drowned out. Mom called Dad over, and together they hurled insults, saying how they were sick of my attitude and that I'd become a burden. Over dishes. Yes, I'd turned 18 that day, but they were making it clear that I was nothing more than an inconvenience in my own home. I was cornered in the kitchen, tears threatening to escape. Then Christina walked in with a condescending smile. "If she doesn't like it here, let her go live elsewhere," she said flippantly. Dad actually nodded in agreement. He told me, in no uncertain terms, to pack my things and leave. I asked where I was supposed to go, but he just shrugged, repeating that I needed to learn respect. So I went to my room, numb and shaking. Within 20 minutes, I'd thrown some clothes and essentials into a duffel bag, not knowing if I'd ever come back. Before I left, I stood at the front door, half expecting them to change their minds. It was my birthday after all. Part of me still believed there had to be some shred of paternal instinct hidden beneath all that cruelty. But they just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to walk out. I took one last look at the house where I'd grown up, felt a wave of heartbreak, and stepped onto the porch. The door slammed behind me. That was how I became homeless on my 18th birthday. Not by choice, but by the triumphant decree of my own flesh and blood. While I was standing there, I saw Christina in the window, laughing with her phone in hand, probably texting her friends about how they'd canceled my birthday. I never knew you could feel such heavy disappointment in people who were supposed to love you. I wandered around for a while, feeling aimless. Finally, I called my friend Kayla. We weren't super close, but she was one of the few people I'd hung out with after school a couple of times. She sounded shocked when I told her what happened. She told me to come over immediately, that her parents would let me crash on their couch if needed. Her kindness almost made me break down in tears. I took the bus to her house, and her mom welcomed me warmly. They didn't question me too much, just enough to understand the basics. Kayla offered me her bed, insisting she'd take the couch in the living room. I didn't want to cause trouble, but her whole family was set on making me feel at home. It felt surreal to experience that level of warmth after being kicked out. I didn't know how long it would last, but I was grateful. As I settled into Kayla's place, I spent the rest of that night scrolling through social media, wondering what my parents and sister were doing. I saw a few photos posted by Christina's friends. They were partying at our house, ironically. That must have been the real reason my birthday was canceled. They wanted the house for her own celebration. I felt sick to my stomach seeing them all having fun without even a shred of remorse. My 18th birthday, spent as a rejected outcast, while they laughed and danced in the home I used to call mine. But that wasn't even the worst part. While I scrolled, I noticed a certain name pop up in a few comments. One of Christina's friends mentioned that a special guest was still planning on coming. And that's when I remembered. My parents had told me a distant relative, Uncle Robbie, was flying in from out of state for my birthday. Uncle Robbie wasn't just any distant relative. He was a successful entrepreneur who'd built his own company from the ground up. The last time I saw him, I was about 11, and he'd been kind but somewhat aloof. He traveled a lot and rarely kept in touch with the family, but apparently, he'd offered to come to my 18th birthday as a surprise. I'd learned about it accidentally when I overheard Mom talking on the phone weeks ago. I was supposed to be none the wiser, but I'd secretly been excited that someone in my extended family cared enough to visit. Now that they'd canceled my party, they must have forgotten to let him know. If they did remember, they probably assumed he wouldn't show because they'd never told me they'd confirmed his trip. Still, the comments on Christina's post hinted that Uncle Robbie was in town and planning to drop by. I tried to imagine the scene. Uncle Robbie showing up at my house, expecting to celebrate my 18th birthday, only to find a raucous party that had nothing to do with me. A small part of me took pleasure in that scenario because maybe he'd call them out. Another part of me worried they'd twist the story and blame me for not being there. But then it dawned on me. Uncle Robbie was known for his blunt nature. If he saw how they treated me, especially on my birthday, he wouldn't hold his tongue. In fact, he had a history of cutting people out if they disrespected him or people he cared about. I recalled something about him once severing ties with a business partner over an ethics issue, so he definitely wasn't the type to brush off betrayal. That was when the seed of revenge first took root in my mind. I decided to keep quiet and let fate run its course. If Uncle Robbie showed up, my parents and sister would face some uncomfortable questions, but I also wanted more than just a moment of awkwardness for them. I wanted them to feel the sting of their betrayal the way I'd felt it. I'd never been a vindictive person by nature, but getting kicked out on my 18th birthday was the last straw. Kayla's mother overheard me on the phone that evening and saw how distraught I was. She gently suggested that sometimes truth has a way of coming out on its own. She also offered me a chance to stay as long as I needed. I thanked her and promised I wouldn't overstay my welcome. Then I spent the rest of the night strategizing about how to ensure Uncle Robbie learned the full scope of what had happened. Knowing my parents, they'd attempt to spin a sob story about how I was an ungrateful brat who stormed out. If they realized Uncle Robbie would be attending, they'd likely scramble to cover their tracks. But the advantage was that I'd overheard nothing about them reaching out to cancel his visit. My guess was that they were so focused on Christina's event, they completely forgot. The next day, Kayla and I crafted a plan. She suggested I text Christina from a burner phone number, pretending to be one of her acquaintances, and ask if Uncle Robbie was actually coming. That way, I'd have some confirmation. I used a phone app to generate a random number and asked if everything was set for Uncle Robbie's arrival. Christina replied with a flurry of frantic messages, basically confirming that she had no idea how to get in touch with him and that my parents were furious with me for bailing on my party. Later that day, Kayla and I did some detective work on social media. We discovered that Uncle Robbie had posted a photo in a nearby hotel lobby just hours ago. He captioned it with something like, "Back in town for a special birthday, hoping it's as fun as promised." Perfect. He was definitely here. Now, all I needed was to time my arrival to coincide with his visit. I figured he'd show up to the house in the evening, expecting a family gathering. My parents and sister would probably try to pass off Christina's leftover mess as some half-baked attempt at a party. So I asked Kayla for a ride. We borrowed her mom's car under the premise that we were running an errand and headed toward my old neighborhood. My heart was beating a mile a minute, but a spark of adrenaline kept me focused on the upcoming confrontation. We parked a block away, waiting for any sign of Uncle Robbie. After about 30 minutes, a black rental SUV pulled up in front of the house, and out stepped a tall figure in a sharp suit. Definitely Uncle Robbie. He knocked on the door, and from my vantage point, I saw my parents greet him with exaggerated warmth. Christina was behind them, wearing a forced smile. They ushered him in, and the door closed. I checked my reflection in the car window, steeled myself, and told Kayla to drive me right to the driveway. As I walked toward the house, my stomach churned with anticipation. Kayla trailed behind me for support, though she promised not to interfere unless things got out of hand. I rang the doorbell, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. Finally, Dad opened the door, his face dropping at the sight of me. I pushed past him, ignoring his attempts to block me. Uncle Robbie was in the living room setting down a small gift box, presumably for me. Christina and Mom were standing awkwardly near the couch. When Uncle Robbie saw me, his eyes lit up. "There's the birthday girl," he said, extending his arms for a hug. I hesitated for a moment before letting him embrace me. The tension in the room was palpable. Christina shot me a glare that could melt steel, and Mom's face was flushed. Uncle Robbie pulled back, looking confused by the atmosphere. "What's going on here?" he asked, directing his question to everyone but mostly eyeing the awkward stance of my parents. That's when I let it all spill out. I told him how they canceled my birthday without telling me, how I got kicked out over dirty dishes, and how I'd been staying with a friend ever since. My parents tried to interrupt, but I raised my voice, a thing I'd never done before. I demanded they let me speak. I explained how I'd discovered the party was canceled only that morning, how I was thrown out on my 18th birthday, and how I'd been blindsided by their cruel behavior. Christina tried to spin it, accusing me of blowing things out of proportion. She said I left on my own. I held up my phone, showing texts I'd sent to Dad that day, begging him to reconsider and let me stay. Then I turned to Uncle Robbie and said, They never told me you were coming. I only found out through social media. They were too busy hosting a party for Christina last night to care about my birthday. I just wanted you to know the truth." My voice trembled, but I managed to keep from crying. Uncle Robbie's expression darkened. He looked at my parents, waiting for some explanation, but they stood there, fumbling for excuses. Mom stammered something about discipline and respect. Dad tried to claim I'd been rebellious for months. But Uncle Robbie cut them off with a wave of his hand. Then he turned to me, placed a hand on my shoulder, and asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I told him I'd been staying with a friend, but it was only temporary. He nodded, then calmly announced that he would not be associating with people who treated their child in such a demeaning way. Christina started whining about how it was all a big misunderstanding. Uncle Robbie's gaze flicked to her, and he said something that made my heart swell with gratitude. "Mistreating your sister on her birthday is not a misunderstanding. It's cruelty, pure and simple." My parents gaped, and I saw Dad's face twist with panic. Uncle Robbie quietly led me to my old bedroom, allowing me to collect what little remained. My parents trailed behind, stammering apologies now that they realized he'd planned a generous college fund. I refused to forgive them. They had exposed their true colors by kicking me out on my 18th birthday. I gathered my belongings, ignoring their attempts to guilt-trip me. In the living room, Uncle Robbie announced he would place the money under my sole control. My father erupted, yelling that I was turning family against him, but Uncle Robbie silenced him with a warning glance. Without a backward look, I left alongside my uncle, determined never to return. It was the sweetest revenge. No forgiveness, no second chances, just a clean break and the promise of a better life. My parents had betrayed me for the last time, and they'd never benefit from my success. I felt nothing but triumphant relief.